Hello, public opinion aficionados, and welcome to Rasmussen Reports, where the people, not the pundits, tell you what's going on in America. And after last night, oh man, there's going to be a lot going on in America. Now, we here, as very careful consumers of the news, were not surprised by Biden's seemingly uninterrupted 90-minute senior moment, but I can see why many people would. It seems like almost every mainstream media leftist head was blowing up last night. You know, all the ones that likely are getting their talking points fed directly to them from the CIA. And yes, we have numbers to back that up. Believe it or not, 64% of all likely voters think that it's at least somewhat likely that US intelligence agencies are influencing political news in America. Pretty surprising. But what was more surprising is that despite all the prep and all of the rules and all of the time and effort spent, that they couldn't prevent that absolutely stomach churning performance by Joe Biden. But if you haven't been watching us, here's how we framed this debate earlier this week with all of our polling. First, Trump is absolutely crushing Joe Biden in a 2024 rematch. He's up by 9 points in a two-way race. And quite frankly, Trump probably didn't need to do this debate. For the first time, just recently, a majority of Democrats actually say they wanted to see Joe Biden replaced as a candidate. A strong majority of voters see that Joe Biden is in steadily increasing mental decline. And you're definitely not hearing about that on the cheap, fake peddling mainstream news. Voters did predict a very solid Trump win in this debate. But most importantly, the Democrats have no good replacement options. A situation they put themselves in knowing in advance about Joe Biden's steadily increasingly mental disability problems. They knew this was coming, and they didn't do a primary, and they didn't have any strategy. And that's a pretty sick thought, and it puts America in a really unsafe situation. But we've been seeing this debate coming from a long way away, and we have a whole bunch of really interesting numbers saved up. And hold on to the end to see how the very likely switcheroo candidates perform. I think you're going to be pretty surprised. Now, as far as the debate goes, Trump probably could have had some better responses, in our opinion, to some of the questions he was asked. But to be honest with you, it was probably mostly about Trump's demeanor. And there he seemed to knock it out of the park. He presented a very stark contrast to Joe Biden's constant mumbling and meandering. Joe Biden clearly lost. And how you know that is how every leftist news organization is in unison saying that it was a complete disaster. It almost seems coordinated, and that's something we're probably going to be polling on in the very near future. But here's what the numbers said. Who is most likely to win the first debate? 37% of voters said Joe Biden. 47% said Donald Trump. Only 69% of Democrats say Joe Biden was going to win, but 81% of Republicans said Donald Trump would win, and Trump was winning by 14 points among independents. And also, there was a very clear validation of this question. Donald Trump is 78 years old. Joe Biden is 81 years old. Which candidate is more likely to have problems in this debate because of his age? And voters overwhelmingly said Joe Biden, 57% to Donald Trump, 32%. And Democrats were split, 43% to 43%. 43% of Democrats, just as many people said that age would be a problem for Joe Biden as it would for Donald Trump. And that's a really crazy signal. And independents overwhelmingly thought Joe Biden by basically a 2-1 margin. So voters predicted a Trump win, and voters were absolutely right. But back in January, here's some of the evidence that, this Joe Biden mental situation did not come out of the blue. Back in January, from 943 U.S. likely voters, do you feel like over time, President Joe Biden is getting less and less mentally sharp And 59% of voters said yes, only 33% said no. 36% of Democrats said yes, only 54% said no. And among independents, it was 2-1 yes. And how likely is it that the news media are helping to cover up evidence of President Biden's declining mental sharpness? And look at this: 61% of Americans said it was at least somewhat likely, 45% said very likely. So more Americans say that it's very likely the media is covering up Joe Biden's declining mental sharpness than would actually vote for Joe Biden in a 2024 matchup. And that's just incredible. Only 20% of the electorate emphatically defends the news media here, and only 34% of Democrats, only 54% of Democrats combined say it's not likely. And of course, Republicans know what's going on. They've seen the videos. They don't need to be gaslit about cheap fakes. It's really hard to hide. And of course, independents, 62% of them said it's at least somewhat likely the news media is lying about Joe Biden's brain. Only 16% say not at all likely. And I think this is one of the major themes here. Is it more about Joe Biden's performance, or is it more about the absolutely artificial media response to Joe Biden's, quite frankly, expected performance? But again, this is proof that voters have known for a long time about Joe Biden's failing state of mind. This is from almost a year ago. How confident are you that Joe Biden is physically and mentally up to the job of being president? And the reason we picked this date is because this is an early enough date that the Democrats could have done a pretty effective primary process. And back then, only 25% of voters were very confident that Joe Biden was up to the job. Only 43% of Democrats, but look at independents. Only 20% of independents were very confident. And Joe Biden needs to win those independents by a majority in order to take home the prize. Only 38% of independents said at least somewhat confident. 27% of Democrats said not confident. Look, 79% of Republicans. Besides the border, this is really one of the key issues driving Republicans' negative opinions about Joe Biden. But 57% of independents were not confident that Joe Biden was physically and mentally up to the job of being president, again, back when the Democrats could have held a primary. If he's reelected in 2024, Joe Biden would be 86 years old when his second term ends. Is 86 years old too old to be president? And voters overwhelmingly said yes by a 25-point margin. 55% yes to only 30% who said no. And Democrats were basically split, 41% to 44%. And again, look at independents. A majority said that Joe Biden was too old to be president back when Joe Biden could have been primaried. Only 29% said no. And now we're going way back to the beginning of 2022. Joe Biden's presidency was barely a year old. And again, these numbers were pretty stable. This isn't some new thing. Voters knew this guy's brain was going downhill. Only 42% of voters were confident that he was physically and mentally up to the job. Only 27% very confident. And 56% were not confident. 80% of Republicans, 27% of Democrats, and again, 62% of independents. Stunningly large number. Believe it or not, looks like Joe Biden actually won back some support over time. But check this one out. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? President Biden's mental decline and forgetfulness have become more apparent over the past 2 years. And again, we're at 63%, at least somewhat agreeing with that statement, 47% strongly agreeing. So again, you have a signal where more people strongly agree that Joe Biden's declining over time than would vote for Joe Biden in a matchup, 47% to just 40%. And only 22% of U.S. likely voters strongly disagree with that statement. Only 41% of Democrats strongly disagree with that statement. 39% of Democrats agreed that Joe Biden was getting less mentally sharp. But check this one out. Republican members of Congress have called on President Biden to take a test of his cognitive abilities and make the results public. Should Biden take a cognitive test? Because Trump took one in 2018. 66%, 2 out of 3 voters said yes. 26% of voters said no. Yes, 86% of Republicans, 43% of Democrats, and 70% of independents. You really don't see independent numbers that high. They rarely agree on anything with that strong of a signal. And did voters get their cognitive tests? No, they did not. They didn't even get a Democrat primary. But again, with how much unanimity there is in the liberal media, it seems pretty clear that they're going to try and figure out some way to get Joe Biden out of there. And a lot of people have floated options, and we've been telling America for almost a year now that none of those options look really all that viable. And here's what the polling says. And first, it's important to note that, now that the media is all unanimous, it comes very closely on the heels of the first time in all of our polling that a majority of Democrats say they would like to see Joe Biden replaced. This number has always been less than 50%. But for the first time in May, we got to 54% of Democrats at least somewhat agreeing that they need to find another candidate to replace Joe Biden. Only 38% of Democrats disapproved with that idea, and only 26% strongly disapproved. So Democrats wanted a replacement, and that's fine, but none of them could agree on who the best person was. Which of the following Democrats do you think would be a better presidential candidate than Joe Biden? And among all likely voters, Michelle Obama kind of wins, but it's like 14%. She only has a 4-point lead over Kamala Harris, comes in second at 10%. Hillary Clinton at 9%. Gavin Newsom is 7%, only 1 point better than Gretchen Whitmer, who really doesn't have, huge name brand recognition. But look at the party numbers among Democrats. Michelle Obama, who, again, you'd think, Obama was such a beloved president, you'd think his wife would be higher than 21% of Democrats, and she's not. She's barely higher than Kamala Harris, who, again, gets 17%. And Hillary Clinton does way worse than Kamala Harris. Not a very likable candidate. She comes in at 11%. Gavin Newsom's only 8%. And every single one of those candidates is beaten by the none of them response. Even Gavin Newsom is almost beaten by not sure. That's really sad. But it doesn't stop there. We actually predicted some of these matchups and tested them out. Back in March, we pit Donald Trump against both Joe Biden and Gavin Newsom in the same poll to see how they do. And Donald Trump beat Joe Biden by 8 points, but in the same poll, Donald Trump beat Gavin Newsom by 17%, over twice the margin that he beats Joe Biden by. That's just absolutely horrible. Democrats only gave Gavin Newsom 60% of their vote, whereas they gave Joe Biden 76%. Donald Trump did better. Less people voted for Newsom than Biden among Republicans. But look at that independent lead. It's up to 19 points for Donald Trump over Gavin Newsom. So that's a very clear sign that he isn't a very likable candidate. Now, we also did Michelle Obama, and here she's losing to Donald Trump by 7 points. That is 1 point better than Joe Biden. So she is a better candidate. But to be honest, she doesn't really do any better. She does worse among Democrats than Joe Biden. She does about the same with Republicans. Independents do kind of like Michelle Obama, but they still give Donald Trump an 8-point edge. And here's the proof. Gavin Newsom just isn't that very likable. Now, these numbers are driven down a bit by a 21% not sure rating, but he only gets to a total 35% favorability number amongst all likely voters. And again, if we polled Biden right now, the number would probably be 43%. So he's doing almost double digits worse. That's just crazy. And among Democrats, he only has a 59% favorability rating. That's horrible. They got to get behind that guy with an 80 or 90% number if he really wants to win. Only 31% of independents have a favorable impression of Gavin Newsom, only 10% very favorable. He actually polls almost as bad among independents as he does among Republicans, and Republicans really do not like this guy. Then here again is another Gavin Newsom matchup, and this one done just over a week ago and not back in March. And Gavin Newsom, okay, he's tightened the race some, but it is 50% to 38% Donald Trump winning in a head-to-head by 12 points. Again, Gavin Newsom not getting over 70% among Democrats, not even getting close to Joe Biden. Donald Trump still taking 83% of the Republican vote and only losing 10% of it. And Donald Trump winning by 12 points among independents. So Gavin Newsom's picked up a little bit of support among independents, maybe a tiny bit among Democrats, but 12 points down. Where does that leave the Democrats? Kamala Harris, I'll tell you, she's not much of a better option. This is just from this week, believe it or not, and her favorability numbers are quite a bit better than Gavin Newsom, but she's still doing worse than Biden. She does okay among Democrats, 69%, but 36% among independents. Her very favorable number is higher, but it's still only 18%. And her very unfavorable number among independents is much, much higher than Gavin Newsom's. Kamala Harris is vice president of the United States. Is she doing a better job or worse job than most previous vice presidents? And, this is her legacy to run on. And Americans, by 2.5 to 1 margin, say that she's a worse vice president than previous vice presidents, 49% to 19%. That's really horrible, but only 36% of Democrats say better, 21% say worse. And 61% of Democrats say worse or about the same. And independents overwhelmingly think she's a horrible vice president. So how's she going to win the role of presidency? As vice presidential running mate, does Kamala Harris help or hurt President Joe Biden's chances of getting reelected? It's like a wash. 25% say help, 29% say hurt. Only 44% of Democrats say help. 33% of independents say hurt to only 19% who say help. So she's basically a non-entity as the vice president. But yeah, we actually did a matchup with her back in February of 2023, way over a year ago. And back then, Donald Trump was actually losing to Joe Biden in head-to-head matchups. Here we had him down 3 points. And this is, again, before his campaign totally turned around with a string of successes that involved his visit to East Palestine, Ohio, and his criminal indictments. But he was, again, down 3 back then in 2023. But Kamala Harris, Donald Trump was beating by 45% to 42%. So from down 3 to up 3, a 6-point swing. Joe Biden was doing 6 points better than Kamala Harris was. If those numbers hold up, and again, there's no reason to think that over time Kamala Harris's opinions have really changed at all, that puts her down something like 15 to 16 points on Donald Trump in a head-to-head matchup right now. I guess we're going to have to run it to prove myself wrong. But, I just don't see how any of those options are really viable at all as replacement candidates. So where does that leave us as a country? And where does that leave the Democrats for 2024? Well, we might have to wait a while for it to play out because it looks like Joe Biden doesn't intend on going anywhere. We're going to have to wait and see if 25th Amendment stuff happens, if people somehow convince Joe Biden to resign, and what the August Democrat National Convention looks like. In our opinion, though, the real loser here is the absolutely corrupt mainstream media. The same ones that Democrats will be counting on to download new candidate software into the Democrat electorate here in the next month or two. But the question is, with this much lying and gaslighting going on, there really are people who are now surprised at the current state of Joe Biden's mental situation. Imagine being lied to that much for 3 years. But will people wake up? Will they increasingly reject their programming? Well, follow us if you want to see. And next up on Monday is Joe Biden's new job approval numbers. We are the only people in the entire U.S. polling industry that go out into the field every day and ask Americans what they think about Joe Biden. We think there's probably going to be a really strong reaction to last night's absolutely horrible debate performance. So subscribe to us on YouTube and Rumble if you haven't already. And while you're there, please like the video. Today is also question day, so if you have any ideas, make sure you leave them in the comments on YouTube. Hit us up at Twitter at Rasmussen_poll, and thanks for watching.